Something happens when they walk into a room. People can't quite name it, but they feel it. The volume drops a few decibels. Conversations become careful in ways nobody planned. Someone in the corner who's been performing all evening suddenly stops mid-sentence and looks down at their drink. The awakened empath hasn't said a single word. They haven't done anything. They've just arrived, and the emotional architecture of the room has quietly rearranged itself around their presence. This is the thing that gets called an aura, though the word doesn't really capture it. It's not mystical. It's not light radiating from anyone's body. It's something far stranger and more specific, a psychological coherence so complete that other people register it the way they'd register a change in air pressure. They don't have language for what they're sensing, so they reach for words like intensity or energy or presence. None of those quite land. What they're actually picking up is the absence of something almost everyone else carries: the static, the noise, the constant unconscious negotiation between who someone is and who they're pretending to be. Carl Jung spent decades watching for this quality in his patients, and he found it almost never. He estimated that the vast majority of human beings live their entire lives inside what he called the persona, the performed self, the social mask, the version of themselves they constructed to be acceptable to others. The persona generates a particular kind of noise, a frequency of self-monitoring, of editing, of low-grade anxiety about whether the performance is landing correctly. Other people pick this noise up unconsciously, even when they can't name it. It's the static of most human interaction. It's why so many social situations feel exhausting. You're not just engaging with people, you're engaging with the layers of performance everyone is generating to maintain themselves. The awakened empath has lost that static, not because they tried to, because something burned it out of them. And what's left in its place is the thing other people sense and don't have words for. Today, I'm going to walk you through what this aura actually is in Jung's framework, why it forms only after a specific kind of psychological collapse, what other people perceive when they're near it, why it makes some people unconsciously hostile, and what it costs to become someone who carries it. Because if you've ever been told that you have a strange effect on rooms, that people either gravitate toward you or pull away from you sharply with nothing in between, there's a chance you're carrying this quality without knowing what it is. And Jung's framework explains it in a way no one else does. To understand the aura, you have to understand what it replaces. Jung observed that most empaths spend the first half of their lives in a state he would have described as energetic incoherence. They're picking up everyone else's emotional material constantly, mistaking it for their own, leaking their own emotional content into every space they enter, and trying to manage the chaos through compulsive helping, over-explaining, and 1,000 micro-adjustments to whoever's in front of them. This produces a particular kind of presence, scattered, anxious, slightly apologetic, always reaching toward others to confirm the connection. People can feel that reaching. It registers as need, and while it sometimes attracts other wounded people, it tends to push away anyone whose own stability is fragile. What changes during awakening isn't the empath's sensitivity. The sensitivity stays. What changes is the coherence. The empath stops leaking. They stop reaching. They stop performing the role of the available one, the helpful one, the one who notices everything and serves the room. And in the absence of all that outflow, something gathers in them that wasn't there before. A density, a center of gravity, a quality of being so fully inhabited by themselves that other people experience it almost physically when they enter the same space. Jung had a concept that almost no one talks about anymore, partly because it embarrassed his more rationalist colleagues. He called it the mana personality, a person who, through completing significant psychological integration, accumulates a quality of presence that other people sense as a kind of charge. He borrowed the word mana from anthropological accounts of certain cultures that recognize this quality in their elders and healers and spiritual figures. He wasn't being mystical about it. He was naming something he kept seeing in patients who had completed deep individuation work. They carried something. People felt it. And the people who felt it couldn't explain what they were feeling because Western culture had no language for the phenomenon. The mana personality wasn't a goal in Jung's framework. He warned against it as much as he described it, because identifying with this quality was its own form of inflation, the ego claiming the integration as personal achievement and turning it into another persona. But he acknowledged that the quality itself was real, observable, and almost always emerged in people who had done specific psychological work, particularly people whose original wiring had made them more porous to others' emotional reality, people we'd now call empaths. Here's what Jung discovered about how this aura actually forms, and it's not what the spiritual marketplace would have you believe. It doesn't form through positive practices. It doesn't form through meditation, or through cultivating compassion, or through any of the things that get marketed as paths to higher consciousness. It forms through a very specific kind of psychological burning, the burning away of everything in the empath that was performed, borrowed, or carried for other people. For most of their lives, empaths carry an enormous amount of weight that doesn't belong to them. The unresolved grief of a parent they tried to comfort as a child. The unspoken rage of a sibling who couldn't access their own. The ambient anxiety of every room they walked into. The unmet needs of every person who learned that this particular empath could be relied on to absorb whatever they couldn't process themselves. By the time most empaths reach their 30s or 40s, they're carrying the emotional inheritance of dozens of people, and they've been carrying it for so long they can't distinguish it from their own internal weather. Awakening, in Jung's framework, is the process by which all of that borrowed material gets returned. Slowly, sometimes violently, the empath starts setting down what was never theirs. Old grief that turns out to belong to their mother. Old fear that turns out to belong to their father. Old shame that was handed to them at 5 years old by a family system that needed someone to hold it. Each piece they set down feels, at first, like a betrayal, because they've been carrying it so long that letting it go feels like abandoning the people they carried it for. But as the weight comes off, something else becomes possible. The empath starts to find out what their actual emotional reality feels like underneath everyone else's. This is the first phase of the aura forming, the clearing out, and it doesn't feel good. It feels like grief that doesn't make sense, anger that comes from nowhere, periods of strange flatness that worry the people around them. The empath isn't depressed. They're returning to themselves, but the returning looks, from the outside, like withdrawal, like coldness, like something has gone wrong with the person everyone relied on. The second phase is even harder. Once the borrowed material is mostly gone, the empath has to face the parts of themselves they suppressed in order to carry all of it. The rage they couldn't access because they were too busy holding everyone else's. The selfishness they refused to allow because the persona required them to be endlessly giving. The need for solitude they denied because everyone else's need for their company always seemed more important. Jung would have called this the shadow integration phase. And for empaths, it's especially brutal, because the shadow contains everything that being a good empath required them to disown. The empath has to claim their anger, their refusal, their capacity to walk away from people who are draining them, their right to be unavailable, their willingness to disappoint, all the qualities that empath culture treats as failures of compassion turn out to be the missing pieces of an actual self. And as the empath integrates these pieces, slowly, often with enormous guilt, something begins to consolidate in them that was never there before. A spine, a center, a felt sense of being a complete person rather than a service performed for others. This is where the aura starts to become visible to other people. Not because the empath is trying to project anything, because they've stopped giving themselves away in every direction at once. The energy that used to leak out toward everyone now stays where it belongs. The empath becomes contained. Not closed off, contained. There's a difference. A closed-off person registers as defensive. A contained person registers as whole. And people respond to wholeness in ways they can't articulate. If you're somewhere in this process right now, if you've been feeling the strange flatness, the unfamiliar anger, the urge to withdraw from people you used to serve without question, there's a guide we put together that might help you make sense of where you are. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's framework, built specifically for the integration phase most people go through alone because nobody around them recognizes what's happening. The link is below if you want it. For now, let's keep going, because the part most people don't understand about this aura is what happens after it forms. Once the integration consolidates, the empath becomes someone other people can't quite categorize. They have all the sensitivity they always had. They still feel everything around them, still pick up the undercurrents in any room, but the sensitivity no longer translates into reactivity. They feel the anxiety of someone in front of them without absorbing it. They register the manipulation in a conversation without playing the part being offered to them. They notice what's happening in the room without being pulled into the role the room wants them to play. This is what Jung would have called consciousness in its most practical form, the ability to be aware of unconscious dynamics without being controlled by them. And here's what other people experience when they encounter this quality. They feel seen in a way they're not used to. The awakened empath looks at them and registers what's actually there, the performance, the wound underneath the performance, the longing underneath the wound. The empath doesn't react to any of it, they just see it. And being seen at that depth by someone who isn't asking anything of you is one of the most destabilizing experiences a human being can have. For some people, this destabilization registers as relief. They've spent their entire lives being engaged with at the level of their persona, and suddenly there's someone in front of them who's looking past it. The relief can be overwhelming. People sometimes cry in the awakened empath's presence for no apparent reason. They didn't intend to, didn't expect to, can't fully explain it afterward. What they're experiencing is the release that happens when someone finally encounters them at a deeper level than they're used to being encountered. The persona, which requires constant maintenance, gets a moment of rest. For other people, the same encounter produces the opposite reaction. They feel exposed. Their persona, which they've worked their entire life to perfect, suddenly feels transparent and ridiculous in the presence of someone who clearly isn't fooled by it. This produces an almost immediate hostility, and it surprises everyone, the person experiencing it most of all. They can't explain why this perfectly pleasant, soft-spoken person they just met is making them so uncomfortable. They reach for explanations. The empath is judgmental, arrogant, weird, off-putting. None of those explanations are true. What's actually happening is that the empath's presence is bypassing the persona entirely, and the persona is reacting the way any threatened defense system reacts. Jung wrote about this dynamic in his work on projection. He observed that people who haven't done their own shadow work will often react with intense, irrational hostility to anyone who appears to have done that work, because the integrated person becomes a mirror for everything the unintegrated person has been avoiding. The empath doesn't have to do or say anything provocative. Their existence is provocative to anyone whose internal organization depends on not seeing what the empath has obviously seen in themselves. This is why awakened empaths often develop a reputation that doesn't match anything they've actually done. Word gets around that they're difficult, intense, hard to be around. Other people start to avoid them. Old friendships fade in ways the empath finds confusing because nothing identifiable changed in their behavior. What changed was their presence. And presence, as Jung understood, evokes whatever's been suppressed in the people who encounter it. Some people meet that evocation with curiosity. Most meet it with avoidance. There's a specific loneliness that comes with carrying this aura, and almost no one warns awakened empaths about it. Before integration, the empath was lonely in a familiar way, surrounded by people, performing the role expected of them, never quite seen, but at least embedded in a recognizable social world. After integration, the loneliness changes character. The empath is no longer performing, so the relationships built on the performance can't continue in the same form. Some end entirely. Others thin out into something polite and distant. New connections form, but they form slowly, because the empath has lost their old urgency to fill social spaces with whatever those spaces wanted from them. The aura attracts a particular kind of person and repels another particular kind, and the empath has very little control over which people show up. Other integrated or partially integrated people often gravitate toward them, recognizing something familiar. People doing genuine inner work often seek them out, sensing that they can be honest in this person's presence in ways they can't elsewhere. Children and animals tend to be drawn to them because the persona's noise that confuses other beings has been quieted. But for every person drawn in, there are several who feel an instinctive need to keep their distance, and the awakened empath has to learn to accept this without taking it personally. Jung described this acceptance as one of the final tasks of individuation. The recognition that becoming yourself means becoming someone whom not everyone will be able to tolerate. The understanding that you cannot adjust your presence to make yourself palatable without losing the very integration that made you whole. The awakened empath has to make peace with being intermittently misread, occasionally feared, and sometimes simply avoided by people whose own work isn't ready to encounter what they're carrying. This isn't bitterness, it's clarity, and clarity costs something. There's another quality of the aura that's harder to describe but matters enormously. Awakened empaths develop a kind of stillness that other people experience as the absence of agenda. Most human interaction is saturated with subtle agendas: wanting approval, wanting connection, wanting to be liked, wanting to be useful, wanting to avoid conflict, wanting to seem a certain way. These agendas are usually unconscious, and they create an undertow in every conversation that participants navigate without realizing they're doing it. The awakened empath has, over years of integration, dismantled most of these agendas in themselves. So when they sit across from someone, there's no undertow. The other person isn't being pulled in any particular direction. They get to choose how to be, without the social pressure that usually shapes their behavior. This stillness reads as safety to some people and as eeriness to others. The ones who experience it as safety often describe the empath as the easiest person they've ever talked to, the first person they could really tell the truth to. The ones who experience it as eeriness often can't articulate what's bothering them. They just feel watched or exposed or unsettled in a way that has nothing to do with anything the empath has said. Both reactions are responses to the same quality: the absence of agenda, the willingness to simply be present without trying to extract anything from the encounter. Jung connected this stillness directly to what he called the relationship with the self. He believed that ordinary human consciousness, what most of us walk around with, is dominated by the ego, which is always trying to maintain itself, defend itself, expand itself. The ego is the source of most of our internal noise, and most of the noise we generate in other people's presence. When the ego decenters, when it stops being the primary driver of consciousness and instead becomes a servant of something deeper, the noise quiets. Not entirely. The ego doesn't disappear, but it stops being the loudest voice in the room, and in its quieting, something else becomes audible, a deeper center of gravity that Jung called the self, with a capital S, to distinguish it from the small self of the ego. The awakened empath has access to this deeper center. Their decisions come from there. Their responses come from there. Their presence emerges from there. And when other people are near them, they're not just encountering the empath's personality. They're encountering this deeper organization, which most people only access in rare moments of crisis or grace. The aura is, in a sense, the felt presence of the self operating through a particular human being. Other people sense it because the self in them recognizes the self in the empath, even when neither person can name what's happening. This recognition produces strange effects. Awakened empaths often report that strangers tell them things they've never told anyone, that people open up in their presence in ways those people themselves find surprising, that difficult conversations become possible around them when they wouldn't be possible elsewhere. The empath isn't doing anything to elicit this. They're just being present, but their presence is permission. It tells the other person without words that the deeper layer is welcome here, that the persona can rest, that whatever needs to come up can come up safely. This is the gift the awakened empath carries, and it's also the burden, because not everyone who opens up in their presence is ready to do anything with what comes up. Some people use the empath's presence to access a depth they'll then run away from, returning to their personas with a slight resentment that they've revealed too much. Others become dependent, wanting to be near the empath constantly, because the empath's presence is the only place they can access this depth in themselves. The empath has to learn to hold space without taking responsibility for what people do with the space. This is one of the hardest tasks of the post-integration life, and most awakened empaths still struggle with it. There's a question Jung came back to repeatedly in his late work, and it applies here. He asked what the purpose of individuation actually was. Why go through all of this? Why endure the dissolution, the integration, the shadow work, the loss of relationships, the isolation, the strange social position? And his answer was that individuation wasn't for the individual. The individuated person becomes a contribution to the collective in a way that the unindividuated person never can. Their presence carries something that the world otherwise lacks. They become, in his words, a vessel for consciousness, a place where the deeper layers of psyche can show up in ordinary life and touch other people who are ready to be touched. The awakened empath is one of the clearest examples of this principle. They don't have to do anything heroic. They don't have to teach, lead, save, or rescue. Their presence itself is the contribution. They walk through the world, and the world is slightly different where they pass through it. Conversations they have go deeper than they would have gone. Decisions other people make in their company tend to be more honest. The ambient consciousness of every room they enter shifts slightly towards something more real. None of this happens because the empath is trying. It happens because of what they're carrying. If you've ever been told that you have this effect on people, and you found it confusing because you weren't trying to have any effect at all, what you're experiencing is the natural consequence of integration. You're not doing it, you're being it. And the difference between doing and being is exactly the difference between the persona and the self. There's one more dimension of the aura that's worth naming, because it's the dimension most likely to confuse the empath who's developing it. The awakened empath often becomes a magnet for the broken, not for casual friends or easy connections, for people in genuine crisis, for people who can't access help elsewhere, for people whose own work has reached a wall and who somehow sense that being near this particular person might help them break through it. This happens whether the empath wants it or not. Strangers approach. Old acquaintances suddenly reach out after years of silence. People in the empath's life start telling them things they haven't been able to tell anyone else. For empaths who haven't fully integrated, this used to be exhausting because they were absorbing everything. For awakened empaths, it's different. They can be present to enormous pain without taking it on. They can witness someone's breakdown without breaking down themselves. They can hold space for darkness that would have overwhelmed them in their old configuration. But they have to learn, sometimes the hard way, that being able to hold space doesn't mean they're obligated to hold it for everyone who shows up wanting it held. This is where the awakened empath's anger, the anger they integrated during their shadow work, becomes essential. Not as cruelty, but as a discernment about who deserves access to what they're carrying. The aura is precious. The presence it represents took years of psychological work to develop, and the awakened empath has to learn to protect it, not by hiding it, but by being selective about where they expend it. Some people are ready to be in this presence and use it for their own awakening. Others are looking for something to consume so they can avoid their own work. The empath has to develop the eyes to tell the difference. Jung's framework helps here because he was always clear that the integrated person retains the capacity for refusal. Wholeness doesn't mean infinite availability. The awakened empath says no more often than the unawakened empath ever could. And the no isn't apologetic, it's clean. Other people sometimes find it shocking because they've gotten used to empaths being endlessly available. But the clean no is one of the clearest signs of actual integration. The empath has reclaimed the right to be unavailable, and they exercise it without guilt because they understand that their availability to everyone was never sustainable and was never actually serving most of the people they were available to. So what does life feel like for the empath who's reached this place? Quieter than they expected, more solitary than they expected, but also stranger and richer than they could have predicted from inside the earlier stages of the process. The relationships they have are fewer but deeper. The conversations they engage in tend to skip the small talk that used to exhaust them and go directly to whatever matters. Their internal weather is mostly their own, recognizable to them in ways it never was before. And when they walk through the world, they carry this thing they didn't ask for and can't put down. This density, this stillness, this presence that affects other people whether they intended it or not. Some days it feels like a gift. Other days it feels like a strange responsibility they didn't sign up for. But it's never not theirs anymore. The integration that produced it can't be undone. The empath can't go back to being scattered, leaky, available, performing. Those configurations are gone. What's left is who they actually are, the person they were underneath all the borrowed weight, finally allowed to exist in their own skin. This is what Jung was pointing toward when he talked about individuation as the central work of a human life. Not the achievement of perfection, not the attainment of enlightenment, the simple, brutal, transformative process of becoming who you actually are. And for empaths, whose original wiring made them especially porous to other people and especially loaded with material that didn't belong to them, this becoming is more difficult and more dramatic than it is for almost anyone else. The journey from leaking empath to integrated empath is one of the longest journeys a psyche can make. And the aura the integrated empath carries is evidence that the journey can be completed. If you've been recognizing yourself anywhere in what I've described, if the strange social effects, the stillness, the lonely position of being seen as both deeply safe and deeply uncomfortable by different people sounds like your actual life, then you're not imagining it. You're not making it up. You're not being grandiose. You're describing what happens when an empath does the work that almost no one does, and ends up carrying what almost no one carries. And if you're in the middle of the process, still in the burning, still setting down what isn't yours and discovering what is, what you're going through is exactly what's required for the aura to form. Don't rush it. Don't perform an integration you haven't actually completed. The depth of what you'll carry on the other side depends entirely on the depth of what you're willing to face right now. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this stretch of the road. 24 reflection exercises shaped around Jung's framework for integration, made for empaths working through the long process of figuring out what belongs to them and what they've been carrying for everyone else. If you want a companion for this work, the link is right below.